Excuse me, there's obviously been some terrible mistake here and I need you to fix it immediately. The words cut through the busy hum of Flight 847's first-class cabin like a blade sharp and demanding in a way that made every passenger within earshot pause their conversations and look up from their phones. Victoria Ashford stood in the aisle, her platinum blonde hair perfectly styled, despite the early morning hour, her Hermes handbag clutched in manicured fingers that trembled slightly with what could have been anger or shock, but was definitely not uncertainty about her own importance in this moment. Dr. Jerome Williams looked up from where he was helping his 8-year-old nephew Tommy buckle his seatbelt, the child's eyes wide with excitement about his very first airplane ride, completely unaware of the storm that was about to break around them. Jerome had worked double shifts for 3 months to afford this upgrade to first class, wanting to make Tommy's trip to the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry something special, something the boy would remember forever, though not in the way it was about to become unforgettable. "Ma'am, is there something I can help you with?" Sarah Chen, the lead flight attendant, approached with the kind of practiced smile that airline employees perfect after dealing with thousands of passengers, though something in Victoria's tone had already put her on edge the way a dog might sense an approaching thunderstorm before the first clouds appear. Victoria gestured with barely contained disgust toward seat 1B, where Jerome sat in his crisp navy suit, his medical conference badge still clipped to his jacket pocket, looking every inch the accomplished neurosurgeon he was, except for the one thing Victoria couldn't overlook. "This man is sitting in first class, and I need to know how that happened because clearly someone has made an error that needs to be corrected before this plane goes anywhere." Tommy looked up at his uncle with the kind of innocent confusion that only children possess, his voice carrying the pure curiosity of someone who hasn't yet learned that the world can be cruel for no reason at all. "Uncle Jerry, why is that lady looking at us like that? Did we do something wrong?" Jerome's jaw tightened imperceptibly, the same way it did when he was about to perform a delicate surgery and needed every muscle in his body to remain steady and controlled, because 8-year-old boys shouldn't have to learn about hatred at 30,000 feet. But the world rarely cares about what children should or shouldn't experience. "No, Tommy, we didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes grown-ups get confused about things, but everything's going to be fine." Sarah checked her tablet with the efficiency of someone who had dealt with passenger complaints countless times before, though something about this situation felt different, heavier, like the air pressure change that happens right before turbulence hits. "Sir, you're Dr. Jerome Williams. Seat 1, be upgraded using frequent flyer miles, and this young man is Tommy Williams, Seat 1. Correct?" "That's right," Jerome replied calmly, his voice carrying the measured tone he used with anxious parents in the hospital, steady and reassuring, despite the growing tension in the cabin around them. Victoria's face flushed a deep red that clashed terribly with her expensive silk blouse, her voice rising to a pitch that made several passengers in economy class turn their heads to see what was happening up front. "I don't care what your computer says. There's obviously been some kind of mix-up because people like him don't belong in first class, and I absolutely refuse to sit next to someone who clearly used some kind of fraudulent means to get that seat." In the cockpit, Captain Riley Thompson finished his pre-flight checklist with the methodical precision of someone who had flown combat missions in Afghanistan and knew that attention to detail was the difference between life and death, though he had no idea that in a few minutes he would face a different kind of battle that would test every principle he held dear. The former Air Force pilot adjusted his headset and glanced at his co-pilot, a younger man named Kevin Rodriguez, who was reviewing weather patterns for their route to Chicago. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to lower your voice and return to your seat so we can complete our boarding process," Sarah said, though her training manual had never covered a situation quite like this, where a passenger's complaint was so obviously rooted in something much uglier than a seating mix-up. Victoria drew herself up to her full height, which wasn't particularly impressive physically, but seemed to fill the entire cabin with her sense of entitlement, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered in her carefully curated world. Do you have any idea who I am? My late husband, Richard Ashford, built half the commercial real estate in this city, and I have personally donated more money to this airline's charity events than most people make in a year, so when I tell you there's a problem, you fix it immediately. Tommy tugged on Jerome's sleeve with the gentle persistence of a child who doesn't understand why the adults around him were getting so upset about something that seemed perfectly normal to his young eyes. Uncle Jerry, I like our seats. The windows are really big and the lady gave us extra cookies. Why does that lady want us to move? Jerome's heart broke a little more with each innocent question, knowing that this moment would be seared into Tommy's memory forever. The first time he truly understood that some people would judge him not for his character or actions, but for the color of his skin, a lesson no child should have to learn, but one that black parents and guardians had been preparing their children for generations. Sometimes Tommy people have ideas in their heads that aren't very nice, but that doesn't mean we did anything wrong, and it doesn't mean we have to accept being treated badly. The other first-class passengers were beginning to take notice of the commotion, some pulling out their phones to record what was clearly becoming more than just a simple seating dispute, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, not sure whether to intervene or pretend they couldn't hear every word of the increasingly heated exchange. Unbeknownst to everyone around him, Federal Aviation Administrator Director James Foster sat quietly in seat 3C, traveling incognito, as part of his ongoing investigation into discrimination patterns across major airlines, taking mental notes on exactly the kind of incident that his department had been receiving complaints about for years. At 62, he had seen enough corporate cover-ups and institutional bias to recognize the real thing when it was happening right in front of him, and what he was witnessing was textbook discrimination disguised as customer service concern. I paid full price for a first-class ticket. Victoria continued, her voice gaining volume and venom with each word. And I expect to be seated next to people of my caliber, not next to someone who obviously doesn't belong here, and probably used affirmative action or welfare fraud or whatever scheme these people use to get things they haven't earned. The cabin fell silent, except for the soft hum of the aircraft's systems and the gentle whoosh of air conditioning. But the silence felt heavy and dangerous, like the moment before lightning strikes, when everyone can sense that something terrible is about to happen, but no one knows exactly what form it will take. Sarah looked around the cabin desperately, her training telling her to de-escalate the situation, while her conscience screamed that what she was witnessing was fundamentally wrong, the kind of blatant discrimination that made her ashamed to be associated with an industry that claimed to welcome all passengers equally, Mrs. Ashford. I understand you have concerns, but both Dr. Williams and his nephew have legitimate tickets and have done nothing to warrant being moved. Perhaps if you'd like to speak with the captain. Yes. Victoria's eyes lit up with the satisfaction of someone who had just been offered exactly what they wanted, her voice carrying the triumphant tone of someone who believed that speaking to a manager would automatically result in getting her way. Get me the captain immediately, a real authority figure who understands how business works and knows the kind of passengers who keep this airline profitable. Tommy looked up at Jerome with the kind of trust that only children have for the adults who love them, his small hand reaching for his uncle's larger one, seeking comfort in a situation that felt scary even though he couldn't quite understand why. Uncle Jerry, are we in trouble? That lady seems really mad at us. Jerome squeezed Tommy's hand gently, drawing on every ounce of strength and dignity he possessed to remain calm in front of his nephew, knowing that how he handled this moment would teach Tommy something crucial about standing up for yourself while maintaining your humanity. No, buddy, we're not in trouble. Sometimes adults get upset about things that don't make much sense. But we're going to handle this, like the gentleman we are, okay? Director Foster watched the scene unfold with the clinical eye of someone who had spent years documenting patterns of discrimination across transportation industries. Recognizing this as a perfect example of the kind of incident that his department needed concrete evidence to address, he discreetly activated the voice recording app on his phone, knowing that this conversation could become crucial evidence in the broader investigation he was conducting into airline passenger treatment. Sarah reluctantly picked up the intercom phone to contact the cockpit, her voice tight with stress as she spoke to Captain Thompson. "Captain, we have a passenger situation in first class that requires your attention. A passenger is demanding that another passenger be removed from their assigned seat, and the situation is escalating." In the cockpit, Captain Thompson's expression darkened as he listened to Sarah's carefully worded explanation, his military training helping him read between the lines of what she wasn't quite saying directly over the intercom system. He had dealt with unruly passengers before, but something in Sarah's tone suggested this was different, more serious than someone complaining about meal options or overhead bin space. "Kevin, take over the pre-flight," he told his co-pilot, unbuckling his harness with the decisive movement of someone who had made countless split-second decisions under pressure and knew when immediate action was required. "This sounds like it needs personal attention." Victoria smoothed her hair and adjusted her posture as she saw the cockpit door open, preparing to present her case to what she assumed would be a sympathetic authority figure. Another white man in a position of power who would understand her concerns and take appropriate action to restore the natural order of things as she understood it. Captain Thompson emerged from the cockpit and surveyed the scene with the trained eye of someone who had commanded troops in combat situations, instantly assessing the dynamics at play. He saw Victoria's aggressive posture and flushed face, Sarah's obvious distress, the uncomfortable shifting of other passengers, and most importantly, he saw Jerome sitting protectively next to a small boy who was looking around with wide, frightened eyes. "Ma'am, I understand there's a seating concern," Captain Thompson said, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to command, though he was already forming his own conclusions about what was really happening here. "What seems to be the problem?" Victoria stepped forward with the confidence of someone who had never doubted that authority figures would take her side, her voice taking on the reasonable tone of someone presenting an obviously justified complaint. "Captain, I've been a loyal customer of this airline for 15 years, and I've never seen standards drop to this level. I paid premium prices for a premium experience, and I shouldn't have to sit next to people who clearly don't belong in first class." Tommy looked up at the captain with the direct gaze of childhood innocence, his voice carrying the simple honesty that only children possess when they ask the questions adults are afraid to voice. "Captain, sir, did my Uncle Jerry and I do something wrong? That lady keeps saying we don't belong here, but Uncle Jerry showed the nice lady our tickets and they have the right numbers on them." Captain Thompson felt something shift inside his chest as he looked down at this earnest little boy, remembering his own mixed-race daughter and the questions she had asked him about why some people treated her differently. Questions that had broken his heart and strengthened his resolve to never let discrimination go unchallenged when he had the power to stop it. Captain Thompson's weathered face showed no emotion as he processed the scene before him. But inside, memories flooded back of his teenage daughter Sophia coming home from school in tears because classmates had told her she didn't belong in advanced placement classes, that affirmative action was the only reason she was there. Not her straight-A grades and brilliant mind that reminded him every day why he fought so hard to make the world a better place for the next generation. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who had commanded military personnel in life-and-death situations and knew exactly how to project authority without raising his voice. "You mentioned that these passengers don't belong in first class. Can you explain to me what you mean by that statement?" Victoria's confidence faltered slightly at the captain's neutral tone, but she pressed forward, assuming that once she explained the situation properly, any reasonable person would see her point. "Captain, surely you can see that there's been some kind of error here. People of their background simply don't travel first class, and I have serious concerns about how these seats were obtained. I'm worried about credit card fraud or some kind of charitable program that's been abused." Tommy tugged on Jerome's sleeve again, his whispered voice somehow carrying in the tense silence of the cabin. "Uncle Jerry, why does she keep saying we don't belong? You're a doctor and you save people's lives. Doesn't that mean you belong everywhere?" The simple logic of childhood cut through all the adult complexity and pretense, laying bare the fundamental absurdity of Victoria's position in a way that no amount of legal arguments or policy discussions could have achieved. Jerome felt his throat tighten as he realized that his nephew was receiving his first real lesson in how the world would see him, not for his intelligence or kindness or potential, but for something as arbitrary as the color of his skin. Captain Thompson looked directly at Jerome, his pilot's training helping him assess character, the way he evaluated weather conditions, with careful attention to what was really happening beneath the surface. "Dr. Williams, I presume I can see your medical conference badge. Are you traveling on legitimate tickets purchased through normal channels?" "Yes, sir," Jerome replied with the quiet dignity of someone who had spent his entire career proving himself in rooms where people expected him to fail, his voice steady despite the humiliation of having to justify his presence in a seat he had legally purchased. "I used frequent flyer miles accumulated through business travel to upgrade our seats. I wanted my nephew's first flight to be special." Director Foster continued his covert observation of the situation, recognizing that this captain was handling the incident very differently than the typical airline response to passenger complaints, which usually involved appeasing the loudest voice regardless of who was actually in the right. His decades of experience investigating transportation discrimination had taught him to recognize the rare moments when individual integrity collided with institutional pressure, and he sensed he was witnessing exactly such a moment. Victoria's voice rose again as she realized the captain wasn't immediately siding with her, her sense of entitlement warring with a growing panic that she might not get her way. "Captain, I am a Diamond Elite member of your frequent flyer program. My family has donated millions to this city's charities, and my late husband's company employed thousands of people. When I express concerns about passenger safety and appropriateness, those concerns should be taken seriously by someone in your position." "Ma'am," Captain Thompson said, and something in his tone made Victoria stop talking mid-sentence, recognizing the shift from polite customer service to something much more serious. "Passenger safety is indeed my top priority. And right now the only safety concern I see in this cabin is the hostile environment you're creating for a child and his guardian who have done absolutely nothing wrong." The other first-class passengers had stopped even pretending to mind their own business, some openly recording the confrontation on their phones, while others whispered among themselves. But the general sentiment seemed to be shifting toward support for Jerome and Tommy, especially as they watched the little boy's confused and frightened face. Tommy looked up at Captain Thompson with the kind of hero worship that children reserve for people in impressive uniforms, his voice carrying a mixture of excitement and anxiety as he tried to process what was happening around him. "Captain, are you going to make us get off the airplane? Because Uncle Jerry promised we could see the big science museum, and I've been looking forward to it for months." Captain Thompson knelt down to Tommy's eye level, his expression softening as he spoke directly to the child with the same gentle authority he used with his own daughter. "Son, you and your uncle aren't going anywhere except Chicago exactly like you planned. Sometimes adults need to have difficult conversations about treating people fairly, but that's not your worry. Your job is just to enjoy your first airplane ride." Victoria's face went through several shades of red as the full implications of the captain's words sank in her voice, rising to a pitch that made several passengers wince as she realized that her assumed authority was crumbling in real time. "Are you actually taking his side? Do you have any idea what this will cost your career when I report this conversation to the airline executives who happen to be personal friends of mine?" Captain Thompson stood up slowly, his full height and presence filling the first-class cabin as he made the kind of decision that separates ordinary people from those who choose to do what's right regardless of the personal cost. "Mrs. Ashford, You have two choices available to you right now. You can take your seat in 2A, buckle your seatbelt, and allow us to complete our departure procedures in a professional manner, or you can remove yourself from my aircraft voluntarily before I have you removed involuntarily." The cabin fell completely silent, the kind of profound quiet that happens when everyone realizes they're witnessing something significant, a moment when principles matter more than procedures, and when individual character is revealed under pressure. Even the flight attendants from economy class had gathered near the curtain dividing the sections drawn by the tension and drama unfolding in first class. "You cannot be serious," Victoria sputtered, her voice wavering between outrage and disbelief as she realized that her usual tools of intimidation and social pressure were having no effect on this particular authority figure. "I am not the problem here. I am a paying customer with legitimate concerns about safety and propriety, and you are choosing to side with people who clearly don't understand proper airline etiquette." Tommy leaned close to Jerome and whispered loudly enough for several people to hear his child's voice cutting through the adult posturing with devastating simplicity. "Uncle Jerry, I think that lady is scared of us, but I don't know why. We're nice people, aren't we?" Jerome felt his heart break and swell simultaneously as he pulled his nephew closer, knowing that this moment would become part of Tommy's understanding of how the world worked, but hoping that the boy would also remember how the captain stood up for what was right, even when it would have been easier to take the path of least resistance. "Yes, Tommy, we are nice people. And sometimes when nice people are treated unfairly, other nice people step in to help. That's what the captain is doing right now." Captain Thompson reached for the intercom handset with the deliberate movement of someone who had made his decision and was prepared to face whatever consequences followed his finger hovering over the button that would broadcast his words to the entire aircraft and effectively end any possibility of quietly resolving the situation. Director Foster leaned forward slightly in his seat, recognizing that he was about to witness either an extraordinary act of moral courage or a spectacular career-ending mistake, and knowing from his years of investigating discrimination cases that sometimes the two were indistinguishable until history had time to render its judgment. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Thompson speaking." His voice echoed through the aircraft with the clear authority of someone who commanded respect through competence rather than intimidation. Due to a passenger creating an unsafe environment through discriminatory behavior directed at a fellow passenger and a child, Flight 847 service to Chicago is being canceled effective immediately. The announcement hit the cabin like a physical force, generating gasps, confused murmurs, and the immediate buzz of 200 passengers trying to process what they had just heard, while Victoria stood frozen in the aisle, her mouth opening and closing silently as she realized that her attempt to remove Jerome had instead resulted in everyone being removed, including herself. "All passengers will be deplaned and rebooked on alternative flights." Captain Thompson continued his voice, remaining steady and professional despite the magnitude of the decision he had just made. "Ground crew and gate agents will assist with rebooking and any necessary accommodations. On behalf of the flight crew, we apologize for this inconvenience, but we will not operate any flight where passengers are subjected to harassment based on their race or any other personal characteristic." The immediate aftermath of Captain Thompson's announcement created a surreal mixture of chaos and solidarity as passengers began processing what had just happened, some angry about the delay, but many others expressing support for the captain's decision, particularly as they observed Victoria's continued meltdown in the face of consequences she had never anticipated. "You cannot do this!" Victoria shrieked, her carefully maintained composure completely shattered as she realized that her attempt to assert social dominance had instead made her the focal point of hundreds of angry passengers whose travel plans had just been disrupted by her behavior. "This is discrimination against me. I'm the victim here. I'm being persecuted for having legitimate safety concerns." Tommy looked around at the chaos with wide eyes, but instead of fear, his expression showed the fascination of a child witnessing something unprecedented. Something that his 8-year-old mind recognized as important, even if he couldn't fully understand all the implications. Uncle Jerry, did the captain really cancel the whole airplane just to help us? Jerome struggled to find words that would help his nephew understand the magnitude of what Captain Thompson had just done, knowing that this moment would shape Tommy's understanding of justice and moral courage for the rest of his life. "Yes, buddy," he did. The captain decided that treating people fairly was more important than staying on schedule, and that's the kind of person you want to be when you grow up. Sarah Chen approached Jerome and Tommy with obvious relief on her face, her professional demeanor giving way to genuine human emotion as she realized she had just witnessed her captain take a stand that most people in his position would never have the courage to make. Dr. Williams, I want to personally apologize for what you and your nephew experienced today. We'll make sure you're both taken care of with rebooking and any accommodations you need. Director Foster rose from his seat and approached the group with the deliberate movement of someone who had been waiting for exactly the right moment to reveal himself, his federal identification ready, as he prepared to transform what had been a customer service incident into something much more significant. Dr. Williams, I'm Director James Foster with the Federal Aviation Administration. I've been observing this situation as part of an ongoing investigation into discrimination in commercial aviation, and I'd very much like to speak with you about what just occurred. The revelation that a federal aviation official had witnessed the entire incident sent a visible shock through Victoria, who suddenly realized that her behavior had been observed and potentially recorded by someone with the authority to make her life very complicated. Her threats about connections and influence seeming much less powerful when faced with actual federal oversight. Jerome looked at Director Foster with a mixture of surprise and growing understanding, recognizing that what had felt like a random encounter with prejudice might actually be part of something much larger, a pattern of discrimination that extended far beyond this single flight and this one passenger. Director Foster, I'd be happy to cooperate with any investigation, though. Honestly, I was just trying to give my nephew a nice trip to see some dinosaurs. Airport security appeared at the aircraft door with the efficiency of professionals who had been alerted to expect a difficult passenger removal, their presence adding an official weight to Captain Thompson's decision that made it clear this was no longer a customer service dispute but a law enforcement matter. Mrs. Ashford. Captain Thompson addressed Victoria directly, his voice carrying no animosity but absolute finality. You'll need to gather your belongings and accompany airport security for processing. Your behavior today has violated several federal regulations regarding passenger conduct and creating disturbances on aircraft. Tommy watched Victoria being escorted away with the intense curiosity of childhood, then looked up at Jerome with a question that demonstrated wisdom beyond his years. Uncle Jerry, do you think she learned anything from what happened? Maybe she'll be nicer to people now. The innocent hope in Tommy's voice reminded everyone present that children often see possibilities for redemption and change that adults have given up on, and that sometimes the most profound lessons come from the mouths of those too young to have learned cynicism and despair. Director Foster guided Jerome and Tommy to a quiet corner of the terminal, while the chaos of rebooking and passenger accommodation swirled around them, his experienced eyes taking in every detail of how the airline staff was handling the aftermath of such an unprecedented decision by their captain. Dr. Williams, what you experienced today unfortunately fits a pattern we've been investigating across multiple airlines where passengers of color are subjected to enhanced scrutiny challenges to their ticket legitimacy and often removal from flights based on pretextual complaints. Jerome listened with growing amazement as Director Foster explained the scope of the federal investigation, realizing that Victoria's behavior was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader culture of discrimination that had been allowed to flourish in the airline industry through a combination of customer service policies that prioritized avoiding confrontation over protecting passenger rights. Director, I had no idea this was so widespread. I thought this was just one ignorant person having a bad day. Tommy tugged on Director Foster's sleeve with the fearless curiosity that allows children to ask important questions that adults are often afraid to voice. Mr. Foster, are there a lot of mean people like that lady who try to make other people feel bad? And do we have enough nice people like Captain Thompson to stop them? Director Foster knelt down to Tommy's level with the same respect that Captain Thompson had shown, recognizing that this child's questions cut straight to the heart of why his investigation mattered so much to the future of civil rights in transportation. Tommy, there are some people who haven't learned how to treat others fairly, but there are also people like your uncle and Captain Thompson who stand up for what's right. My job is to make sure the good people have the support they need to protect everyone. Meanwhile, Victoria was being processed through Airport Security's Incident Management System, her earlier threats about connections and influence proving remarkably ineffective when confronted with federal aviation regulations, and the clear evidence of her discriminatory behavior, witnessed by dozens of passengers and recorded on multiple phones. Her family's wealth and social status, which had insulated her from consequences for most of her 70-year life, suddenly seemed irrelevant in the face of actual accountability. Captain Thompson faced his own reckoning with airline management, who had been alerted to the flight cancellation and were trying to balance their horror at the potential liability and negative publicity against their recognition that their captain had taken a principled stand that was already generating positive media coverage and public support. The airline's corporate communications team was frantically crafting statements that would allow them to support their captain's decision while minimizing their legal exposure to discrimination claims. Sarah Chen provided a detailed written statement documenting every aspect of Victoria's behavior from her initial demands through her escalating racist commentary, knowing that her testimony would be crucial in any potential legal proceedings, and wanting to ensure that the record clearly showed that Jerome and Tommy had done absolutely nothing to provoke or justify the treatment they received. The story was already spreading across social media as passengers shared their videos and accounts of the incident with hashtags like #CaptainThompson and #FlightCanceled trending, as people debated whether the captain had made the right decision to ground an entire flight rather than allow discrimination to go unchallenged. The viral nature of the story meant that both Victoria and Captain Thompson would soon find their lives forever changed by the choices they made in those crucial minutes. Jerome called his sister to explain why he and Tommy would be delayed, finding it difficult to summarize the surreal experience of watching an airline captain sacrifice his schedule and potentially his career to defend their right to sit in seats they had legitimately purchased. Lisa, I don't even know how to begin explaining what just happened, but Tommy is safe and he just learned something about courage that I could never have taught him in a classroom. Tommy spent the delay drawing pictures of airplanes and Captain Thompson in his coloring book, his child's mind processing the day's events through art and imagination, creating images of uniformed heroes standing up to cartoon villains in a way that helped him understand that good and evil exist in the world, but that good people can win when they're brave enough to act. 6 months later, the federal courthouse in Denver buzzed with media attention and civil rights observers as the case of United States versus Victoria Ashford came to its dramatic conclusion, the culmination of Director Foster's broader investigation into airline discrimination practices that had uncovered a disturbing pattern of incidents similar to what Jerome and Tommy had experienced on Flight 847. Victoria sat at the defendant's table wearing a modest gray suit that was a far cry from her usual designer wardrobe, her platinum hair showing dark roots that hadn't been touched up in weeks. The visible signs of a woman whose world had collapsed around her when her behavior was subjected to public scrutiny and legal accountability for the first time in her privileged life. Jerome entered the courthouse holding Tommy's hand, the now 9-year-old boy walking with confidence and purpose as they prepared to testify about their experience. though Tommy was more excited about missing school to visit a real courtroom than he was concerned about facing the woman who had tried to have them removed from their airplane seats. Uncle Jerry Tommy whispered as they took their seats in the gallery. "Is that the same mean lady from the airplane? She looks smaller than I remember and not as scary." The observation contained more wisdom than Tommy realized, highlighting how bullies often diminish when stripped of their assumed authority and forced to face consequences for their actions in environments where their usual tools of intimidation and social pressure have no power to protect them from accountability. Federal prosecutor Amanda Richardson presented a comprehensive case that went far beyond the single incident on Flight 847, documenting Victoria's pattern of discriminatory behavior in restaurants, hotels, and other public accommodations, where she had used her wealth and social status to demand that establishments exclude or remove customers she deemed undesirable based solely on their race or ethnicity. The prosecution's star witness was Director Foster himself, who explained to the jury how Victoria's behavior represented exactly the kind of discrimination that federal civil rights laws were designed to prevent, and how the airline industry's traditional approach of accommodating complainers rather than protecting victims had created an environment where such incidents were far too common. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Prosecutor Richardson addressed the panel with the passion of someone who had spent years fighting discrimination cases. This case is about more than one woman's prejudice on one airplane. It's about whether we as a society will tolerate the use of public accommodations as tools for enforcing racial hierarchy, and whether wealth and social status provide immunity from the basic requirement to treat all people with dignity and respect. When Jerome took the witness stand, his testimony was measured and factual, describing Victoria's behavior and demands without embellishment or editorializing, allowing the jury to draw their own conclusions about the nature of her motivations and the impact of her actions on him and his nephew. Dr. Williams prosecutor Richardson asked, "How did Mrs. Ashford's behavior affect your nephew during and after the flight incident?" Jerome looked toward Tommy, who was sitting in the gallery coloring quietly while listening to every word, before answering with the careful precision of someone who understood the weight of his words. Tommy asked me questions that no 8-year-old should have to ask about why someone would hate him without knowing anything about him except the color of his skin. But he also learned that there are people like Captain Thompson who will stand up for what's right even when it's difficult, and I think that lesson has made him stronger and more confident in who he is. When it came time for Victoria's testimony, her lawyer had advised her to express remorse and take responsibility for her actions. But decades of entitlement and self-justification proved difficult to overcome, and her responses revealed a woman who still fundamentally believed she had been wronged, rather than someone who had genuinely grasped the harm she had caused. Mrs. Ashford, Prosecutor Richardson, pressed during cross-examination. "Do you understand that your demand to have Dr. Williams removed from his seat was based solely on his race, and not on any behavior or action on his part?" Victoria's answer revealed the depth of her inability to see beyond her own perspective, her voice carrying the defensive tone of someone who had never been forced to examine her own prejudices. "I believe I was expressing legitimate concerns about appropriateness and proper airline procedures. I never used any racial language, and I was simply asking questions that any concerned passenger might ask." Tommy watched from the gallery with the intense focus that children bring to situations they sense are important, occasionally whispering questions to Jerome that demonstrated his growing understanding of fairness and justice concepts that had been abstract before Flight 847, but were now very real parts of his worldview. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts, including federal civil rights violations and disruption of air commerce charges that carried serious penalties and would forever mark Victoria as someone who had been held legally accountable for her discriminatory behavior. Judge Patricia Morales, a veteran of civil rights law who had presided over dozens of discrimination cases during her 20-year career, addressed Victoria directly during sentencing with words that captured the broader significance of the case beyond its immediate participants. "Mrs. Ashford, Your behavior on Flight 847 represents a mindset that our society has been working to overcome for generations. The law is clear that public accommodations must be open to all people regardless of race, and your attempt to use an airline as a tool for enforcing your personal prejudices violates the most fundamental principles of equal treatment under law. Victoria's sentence included community service, working with civil rights organizations, a requirement that would force her to confront the human impact of discrimination in a way that her insulated life had never required, though whether she would genuinely learn from the experience or simply go through the motions remained to be seen. Outside the courthouse, Jerome and Tommy were surrounded by reporters and civil rights advocates who wanted to hear their thoughts on the verdict and its broader implications. But Jerome's focus remained on ensuring that Tommy understood what had happened and what it meant for his future. Tommy, Jerome said as they walked away from the media crowd, "What do you think you learned from all of this?" Tommy considered the question with the seriousness that he brought to important topics, his 9-year-old mind working to process complex ideas about justice and fairness that many adults struggled to understand. "I think I learned that mean people sometimes get punished for being mean, but the most important thing is that there are good people who will help you when bad things happen, like Captain Thompson and that nice judge lady and you, Uncle Jerry." 3 months later, Jerome and Tommy found themselves back at Denver International Airport, boarding another flight to Chicago for Tommy's long-delayed visit to the Museum of Science and Industry, though this time their experience was dramatically different from their previous attempt to make the same journey. Captain Riley Thompson was waiting for them at the gate, having requested the assignment to their flight as soon as he learned about their travel plans, his presence ensuring that their second attempt at this trip would be everything the first one should have been. Dr. Williams. "Tommy, welcome back. I think you'll find this flight much more peaceful than our last encounter." Tommy looked up at Captain Thompson with the hero worship that he had developed for the man who had sacrificed his schedule and potentially his career to defend their right to travel with dignity. His excitement about seeing his childhood hero again, competing with his anticipation for the museum visit that had been delayed but not forgotten. The other passengers on the flight recognized Jerome and Tommy from the extensive media coverage of their case, but the attention was uniformly positive and supportive, with several people approaching to thank Jerome for his courage in pursuing the case and to tell Tommy how proud they were of how he had handled such a difficult situation with grace and maturity. Uncle Jerry, Tommy said as they settled into their first-class seats, "This feels different than last time. Everyone is being extra nice to us." "Do you think people learned something from what happened to that mean lady?" Jerome looked around the cabin at the smiling faces and welcoming atmosphere, recognizing that while individual incidents of discrimination would certainly continue to occur, the public attention and legal consequences from their case had created awareness and accountability that might prevent other families from experiencing what they had endured. During the flight, Captain Thompson visited their seats to check on them personally, bringing Tommy a pair of pilot wings and spending a few minutes explaining how airplanes fly the kind of attention that transformed what could have been a traumatic association with air travel into a positive experience that would encourage Tommy's lifelong interest in aviation and engineering. 2 years after flight. 847. Tommy Williams stood at the podium of the Denver Youth Leadership Conference, his 11-year-old voice carrying clearly through the auditorium as he addressed an audience of teenagers and young adults who had gathered to hear from speakers who had made a difference in their communities. "My name is Tommy Williams, and when I was 8 years old, I learned something really important about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, and even when it costs you something." Tommy began, his confidence and poise reflecting the growth and maturity that had come from experiencing injustice and seeing it addressed through the courage of good people who refused to remain silent. The audience listened with rapt attention as Tommy told the story of Flight 847 in his own words, focusing not on the discrimination he and Jerome had faced, but on the choices that Captain Thompson and others had made to ensure that right prevailed over convenience justice, over expediency, and human dignity over social pressure. Captain Thompson could have just moved us to different seats to make that lady happy, Tommy explained, his young voice carrying wisdom that resonated with listeners twice his age. It would have been easier for everyone, and nobody would have missed their flights. But he decided that doing what's easy isn't the same as doing what's right, and sometimes the right thing is harder but more important, but more. In the audience, Jerome watched his nephew with pride and amazement, marveling at how the traumatic experience that had threatened to teach Tommy about hatred and prejudice had instead become a lesson in courage and integrity that was now inspiring other young people to think about their own capacity to make a difference in the world. Captain Thompson, who had been invited as a special guest, listened from the front row with tears in his eyes as he heard Tommy describe the impact of his decision to cancel Flight 847, realizing that what had felt like a simple choice to do the right thing had rippled outward in ways he had never imagined possible. The most important thing I learned, Tommy continued, is that everybody has the power to stand up for people who are being treated unfairly, and when you do that, you make the world a little bit better for everyone. You don't have to be a captain or a judge or a grown-up to make a difference. You just have to care about doing the right thing. The standing ovation that followed Tommy's speech lasted for several minutes, but the real measure of its impact would be seen in the actions of the young people who heard his message and carried it forward into their own lives and communities, multiplying the effect of Captain Thompson's original decision to choose justice over convenience. After the conference, Jerome and Tommy joined Captain Thompson for dinner at a restaurant near the airport, their conversation ranging from Tommy's growing interest in becoming a pilot himself to the ongoing changes in airline industry policies that had resulted from the federal investigation triggered by their experience on Flight 847. Tommy Captain Thompson said as their evening together drew to a close, "I want you to know that what happened on our flight taught me something too. I learned that sometimes the most important decisions we make happen in just a few seconds, and we have to be ready to do the right thing even when we don't have time to think about all the consequences." Tommy listened with the focused attention he gave to all of Captain Thompson's words, recognizing that this man who had become his hero and mentor was still learning and growing from their shared experience, demonstrating that wisdom and courage were not destinations, but ongoing journeys that required constant commitment and renewal. Victoria Ashford's community service assignment had led her to volunteer at a civil rights organization that worked with discrimination victims, an experience that had forced her to confront the human impact of prejudice in ways that her previous life of privilege had never required. While her transformation was slower and more difficult than the inspiring changes in others, she had begun to understand how her behavior had perpetuated harm and was working, however imperfectly, to make amends for her actions. Director Foster's investigation had resulted in industry-wide policy changes that provided better training for flight crews on recognizing and addressing discrimination, clearer protocols for handling passenger complaints that were based on bias rather than legitimate concerns, and stronger support for employees who took stands against discriminatory behavior, creating a framework that would protect future passengers from experiencing what Jerome and Tommy had endured. 5 years after the incident on Flight 847, the newly opened Captain Riley Thompson Civil Rights Aviation Center hosted its inaugural awards ceremony, recognizing individuals and organizations that had made significant contributions to ensuring equal treatment and dignity for all passengers in commercial aviation. The center, funded through a combination of federal grants and private donations, including a substantial contribution from Jerome's medical practice, served as both a training facility for airline personnel and a resource center for passengers who experienced discrimination, creating a lasting institutional response to the problems that had been highlighted by Tommy and Jerome's experience. Tommy, now 13 and showing the confident leadership skills that had been developing since his childhood encounter with injustice, served as the ceremony's youth presenter, his role symbolizing the next generation's commitment to continuing the work of civil rights and equality that previous generations had begun. 5 years ago, my Uncle Jerry and I just wanted to take a trip to see some dinosaurs at a museum, Tommy told the audience with the easy humor and natural speaking ability that had made him a sought-after youth advocate. We had no idea that our airplane ride would turn into a lesson about standing up for what's right, or that Captain Thompson's decision to cancel our flight would lead to changes that have helped thousands of other passengers travel with dignity. Jerome watched from the audience with quiet pride as his nephew presented the evening's highest honor to Captain Thompson, recognizing that the shy 8-year-old who had once asked innocent questions about why someone would be mean to them had grown into a young leader who understood his own power to create positive change in the world. Victoria Ashford attended the ceremony as well, her presence representing the possibility of redemption and learning, even for those who had caused significant harm through their prejudice and discrimination. Her transformation had been genuine, but difficult, requiring years of community service and personal reflection to understand the impact of her actions and develop authentic empathy for those she had hurt. Dr. Williams Tommy. She approached them after the formal ceremony, concluded, her voice carrying the humility of someone who had been forced to confront her own capacity for cruelty and was still working to become a better person. I know that my apology can never undo the harm I caused, but I want you to know that your courage in pursuing justice has changed not just aviation policies, but also my understanding of how my privilege had blinded me to the experiences of others. Tommy looked at Victoria with the direct gaze that he had inherited from his uncle, assessing her sincerity with the intuitive wisdom that children often possess about adult motivations. Mrs. Ashford. Uncle Jerry taught me that everyone can learn to be better if they really want to. I'm glad you're trying to help other people now instead of being mean to them. The simple acceptance in Tommy's words demonstrated the kind of grace and forgiveness that had made their story resonate with so many people, showing that the response to hatred and discrimination didn't have to be more hatred, but could instead be a commitment to education, understanding, and positive change. Captain Thompson, now serving as the director of the Civil Rights Center that bore his name, reflected on how a single moment of moral courage had expanded into a movement that had touched thousands of lives and created lasting institutional change in an industry that had too often prioritized customer appeasement over passenger protection. Director Foster, who had retired from federal service but continued to advise civil rights organizations, watched the ceremony with satisfaction, knowing that his investigation had provided the framework for accountability and change that made events like this award ceremony possible and necessary. 10 years after Flight 847, Tommy Williams graduated summa cum laude from the Air Force Academy, his childhood dream of becoming a pilot having been inspired by Captain Thompson's example of using aviation as a platform for justice and equality, rather than simply as a means of transportation. His graduation speech, delivered to an audience that included Jerome Captain Thompson and even Victoria Ashford, who had continued her work with civil rights organizations, focused on the responsibility that came with positions of authority and the importance of using power to protect those who were vulnerable, rather than to reinforce existing inequalities. When I was 8 years old, I learned that the most important qualification for leadership isn't technical skill or authority, but the willingness to do what's right, even when it's difficult, Tommy told his fellow graduates. Captain Thompson taught me that every position of responsibility is an opportunity to make the world more fair and more just, and that's the kind of pilot and officer I intend to be. Jerome, now recognized as a leading advocate for civil rights in healthcare and transportation, had established a foundation that provided legal support for discrimination victims and funded research into bias prevention in professional settings, ensuring that the lessons learned from Flight 847 would continue to benefit others long into the future. The airline industry had transformed significantly in response to the federal investigation and public pressure that had followed the Flight 847 incident, with comprehensive bias training, now mandatory for all personnel, clear protocols for addressing discrimination complaints, and strong legal protections for employees who took stands against prejudicial behavior. Victoria Ashford's journey of redemption had led her to become an unlikely but effective advocate for civil rights education, her personal story serving as a powerful example of how even deeply ingrained prejudice could be overcome through genuine commitment to change and willingness to confront one's own capacity for harm. Captain Thompson, whose name had become synonymous with moral courage in aviation, continued to train new pilots and flight crews, ensuring that future generations of aviation professionals understood their responsibility to protect the dignity and rights of all passengers, regardless of race, class, or any other personal characteristic. The final scene of this remarkable story took place at Denver International Airport, where a bronze statue commemorating the courage shown on Flight 847 was unveiled in the main terminal, featuring Captain Thompson, Jerome, and Tommy, with an inscription that read, "In recognition of those who choose justice over convenience and courage over comfort." Tommy, now Lieutenant Williams and preparing for his first assignment as a commercial airline pilot, stood with Jerome and Captain Thompson as they watched travelers of all backgrounds pass by the statue, many stopping to read the inscription and learn about the incident that had helped make their own travel experiences more dignified and fair. Uncle Jerry Tommy said, his voice now deeper but still carrying the same thoughtful quality that had impressed adults when he was a child. "Do you think we made a difference? Do you think what happened to us really changed things for other people?" Jerome looked around the busy terminal, seeing families of every background traveling together without fear of discrimination. Airline employees who had been trained to recognize and prevent bias and policies that prioritized passenger rights over customer appeasement, all of which could be traced back to Captain Thompson's decision to cancel Flight 847, rather than allow hatred to triumph over justice. Tommy Jerome replied, "I think Captain Thompson was right when he told us that doing the right thing creates ripples that spread further than we can imagine. Every person who travels with dignity, because of the changes that came from our experience. Every airline employee who stands up for what's right because they know they'll be supported. Every child who grows up knowing that good people will protect them from unfair treatment. That's our legacy, and it's more powerful than we ever could have hoped. This incredible journey from a moment of hatred to a movement for justice reminds us that ordinary people have extraordinary power to change the world when they refuse to accept injustice as inevitable." Captain Thompson's courage, Jerome's dignity, and Tommy's innocent wisdom combined to create changes that protected thousands of future passengers from discrimination. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It helps these important stories reach more people who need to hear them. Share your thoughts about courage and justice in the comments below, and let us know about times when you've seen good people stand up for what's right. Together we can build a world where every child can travel with the same dignity and respect that Tommy eventually found, and where every person in authority remembers that their most important job is protecting those who need protection most.